grade, and happy Holy Week. So, this is a lecture I normally do. I kind of cancel what we do for Bible for the week normally under normal circumstances. And instead, I do a lecture on what happens the last week of Christ's life before the crucifixion, because of course he does return and is ministering to his disciples after that. So, anyways, this is the week of that, and we're going to go through basically what happens each day of the week in this, and also going through all of the prophecies that are being fulfilled, or at least some of them. I can't get through all of them because there's a lot. But just going through some of the prophecies that are being fulfilled, a lot of the meaning behind it, and kind of making a bit more sense of some of it, because you've all heard the story, I'm guessing, every single year, hopefully. But I'm going to try and kind of elucidate, ooh, fancy words, a little bit more on some of the aspects of that. I'm going to be using my Bible for reference point. If you want to follow along, I'm going to be starting in Matthew 21. I'm going to pull all of this from Matthew. Yes, it's in Luke and in the other Gospels, but I am mostly going to be centering out of Matthew, partially because that's where I have a lot of my notes written down so that I can find things a lot faster. So, also, with that being said, I'm using a literary study Bible, which is an ESV translation. Yes, it is an ESV translation. So, if you have a different translation, it might be different version. It might be slightly different. No, I'm not being a heretic and making up things in the Bible. It is just a different translation. So, here we go. Let's get started. Palm Sunday. Okay, so with Palm Sunday, this starts in Matthew 21. It's the triumphal entry, essentially, and this is fulfilling a prophecy. If you look at verse 5, that's fulfilling a prophecy from Zechariah 9, verse 9, coincidentally, 9:9, which is saying that he will come to you riding on a donkey. This was very much a sign to the people of Israel that Messiah had come, because they were expecting someone who would ride in and just throw out all of the Romans and get rid of the Romans and free Israel and Jerusalem, and we can return to being God's promised people and have no oppressors over us, which is not how it actually happened. And so it's very interesting that there were so many prophecies about out of Egypt I have called my son, and there will be a cry heard in Ramah. And people didn't really connect that for a very long time. They were still expecting someone to ride in on a white shining horse and overthrow them, who would be clearly the king of Israel and just totally take over everything. They weren't expecting someone who was the son of a carpenter, who was born in some dinky little town called Bethlehem and who had to flee to Egypt for several years because Herod was trying to kill him. They weren't expecting that, which is odd considering how many prophecies there were. And people just weren't wanting that. They wanted an overthrow of the Romans almost more than they wanted the Messiah to return, which is really quite sad. So anyways, with Palm Sunday, it's the triumphal entry. He comes in on a donkey. People were putting cloaks on the ground and cutting branches from palm trees. At this point, after this happens, it's a pretty clear sign to most of the people in Jerusalem, this seems like this is the Messiah who has come. So we're waiting for the Romans to go away. Yay. And so immediately after this triumphal entry, all of these people saying, Hosanna, blessed is the Son of David, he goes into Jerusalem and enters the temple and begins turning over tables and making a cord of whips and going absolutely just bonkers. Well, not bonkers. I'm not calling Jesus bonkers, but it's fantastic because there's an overthrow that does happen, but it's not of the Romans. It's not the overthrow people are expecting. It's the overthrow of the hypocrisy that's happening in the temple, of people selling things and money changers. And he comes in and says, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, and you have made it a den of robbers." So he immediately fulfills what he was supposed to do in terms of what they were believing of the Messiah. I'm not saying he's crucified here. I'm saying he fulfilled what they were expecting of the Messiah, an overthrow. They did not expect an overthrow of people being sleazy in the temple with money and selling things at ridiculous prices for sacrifices, and basically just having this as a den of robbers, as he calls it. And he overthrows that, not the Romans, which is just the most fantastic flip, and I love it every time I read it. So he does that, and then as soon as he has done this overthrow, the next verse, verse 14, it says people come to him to be healed in the temple. So he has officially overthrown how the temple is being used completely wrong, and instead turns it into what it's supposed to be, where people come for healing to God. Not necessarily always physical healing, but to pray and to be near God. And he immediately turns it back into what it's supposed to be. And that is just beautiful. And oftentimes I've heard people go, well, it's so weird that there's the switch between this violent chord of whips and overturning tables, and then suddenly he's healing people. And if you're looking at it the right way, you're going, well, of course. He just told them this is what they're not supposed to do. So now, of course, he's going to do what is supposed to be done in the temple. Not take advantage of people, but help people. So he immediately starts healing the blind and the lame who come to him in the temple. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children who were crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what they are saying? And Jesus said, yes. Have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise? Oh, sorry, my light's going crazy. The light in here is a little weird. My apologies. This is actually from Psalm 8, verse 2, where that's coming from. It seems that I am down to one light bulb that is currently functioning in our fixture up there. I'm gonna have to fix that. Okay, sorry. Anyways, back into this. So he immediately refutes them with something from the Psalms, which was written by David, which makes it just so much better, because they're saying, oh, can you believe that they're saying that you're the son of David? And he goes, well, let me quote David to you. And just immediately refutes it. It's just the best. So then after that, he leaves Jerusalem and he spends the night in Bethany. If you remember the story of Lazarus and his sisters, Lazarus is in Bethany. So there's actually a pretty good chance that he was staying with them as their guest in Bethany. Bethany, remember, is one of the Beths. You have Bethany, Bethsaida, Bethel, and Bethlehem, the 4 Beths. Bethany, we don't actually label on our map that I gave you guys. It is really close to Jerusalem. So Beth, a lot of Beths. Anyways, in the morning, he returns to the city, and as he's returning, he sees a fig tree by the wayside. This is verse 18, chapter 21 of Matthew. And he curses the fig tree. And with that cursing of the fig tree, it's fantastic. He is basically saying what he's going to be doing that week, which is, if you aren't producing fruit, which is a prophecy, you will be cast into the fire. And so he basically just did that with the tax collectors in the temple. And now he's giving his disciples another sign of that, saying, here's a fig tree that has shown no fruit. I curse it, and it will never produce any. And so, again, he's doing this. To other people who look at this, they might go, why on earth would he just see a tree and go, yeah, you will die? That's not what he's doing. He's reinforcing this idea of, I am the Messiah, and I have come to separate the righteous and holy from those who are not. And this is another sign of this. I just cast out people from the temple yesterday and cleansed the temple. I am showing you another sign of this, and he will continue to do this for the whole week. So on Monday, he enters Jerusalem, curses the fig tree, and then he goes to the temple again. And as he's teaching, the Pharisees start to question him. This is verse 23 onwards, saying, by what authority do you do these things, and who gave you this authority? And Jesus answered them, I will also ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Because they've just come up and asked him a question, and he says, okay, well, let me return serve. You asked a question, allow me to ask you something in return. And so he says, the baptism of John, where did it come from? Was it from heaven, or was it from man? And they discussed it among themselves, saying, well, if we say that it came from heaven, then he'll ask us, why did you not believe him? But if we say it was from man, we're afraid of the crowd. And for they all held that John was a prophet. So basically they're saying, okay, we can't say John was sent from God, because if we do, he will say, why didn't you believe him when he said stuff about me? So we can't say that, because that's literally admitting guilt. We also can't say, oh no, he was just a random guy who didn't do anything, because the people still hold him as a prophet who was murdered by Herod. We can't say anything. So they said, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by whose authority I do these things. You can kind of already foresee what Jesus was going to say. If they had said it was from God, he would say, I come from the same authority. Which is fantastic, that you can already see the setup of what was going to happen in that conversation. And they were cowards and didn't want to go there and admit they were wrong. So he says, okay, well, once you're able to admit it was from God, then you'll know whose authority I'm doing this by. He doesn't actually say that, but, thought process. Okay. Anyways, he leaves Jerusalem again on Monday and goes back to Bethany, probably with Lazarus and his sisters. Tuesday he comes in and the fig tree has withered, and he confounds the Pharisees, and they cannot answer him, and so this is starting in verse, let's see, is it 28? The parables, which are also called the Olivet Discourses. So these are in chapter 21 and also into chapter 22 with these parables and these discourses. Again, he returns to Bethany after this. Notice he is not spending a single night in Jerusalem. He's not spending any nights in Jerusalem. And so then after this is when Judas then goes to the Sanhedrin and begins to bargain with them, chapters 22 through 25. So Tuesday actually has some of the most from that day in Matthew, because he was going through all of these discourses and all of these preachings, and all of these things that he is teaching them are the same that he said on Palm Sunday with flipping over the tables. It's the same as he said on Monday when he cursed the fig tree. He is just proving over and over again these same points. And one of the biggest parables that he goes for is verse 33 in chapter 21. It's verse 33 through 33 through 43, 10 verses, which is the master of the house who planted a vineyard, and he sends and he has tenants, and he sends them to go get his fruit, and he sends his servants to go and collect, and they beat his servants and send them back, and then he sends more servants, and they beat them worse, and they come back, and so finally he sends his son, saying, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, here is the heir, come, let us kill him and take his inheritance. And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? And they said to him, he will put those wretches to a miserable death, and let out the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him the fruits in their season. And Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Which is Psalm 118. 22 and 23 verses. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. That one should be pretty obvious. And with that, it's so fantastic because he's saying basically, I already said this. He's saying the exact same thing that he said on Sunday and on Monday and now on Tuesday he's saying it. And so with that, when he says, come, what will he do to those tenants? And they say, well, he'll cast them out and he'll get tenants who actually respect him. That's Jesus saying the gospel's about to go to the Gentiles, because you will reject me, and I know this will happen. You will reject me, as you rejected the prophets, as you rejected John, Pharisees. I know you will reject me, and therefore it will go to the Gentiles instead, because of that. And that's fantastic. Now, for Wednesday, also known as Holy Wednesday, there's actually nothing written. It is completely silent. There's no specified thing that happens on Wednesday. It is a silent day. And because it doesn't record that he went into Jerusalem, it's assumed that he actually just stayed in Bethany. And for him, it was just a day away before Thursday when everything is about to start happening. So on Thursday, Peter and John prepare the Passover, and he washes the disciples' feet. Thursday begins on, let me see here. Yeah, Olivet Discourse, it's a lot of chapters where he's talking to the Pharisees. He's talking to the Pharisees for part of chapter 21, chapter 22, all of chapter 23. 23 is the woes. There are, let's see, seven woes that he pronounces on the Pharisees. Holy number. Woe to you, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, a single disciple. And when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. So basically, you teach him to be just like you, which means you reject gospel and you reject John. 3, woe to you, you blind guides, who are blind fools, for what is greater, the gold of the temple, or what has made the gold sacred? Basically just going intense and intricate with their rules and regs. 4, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done, and you've neglected the others. You blind guides. Woe to you, number 5, for you clean the outside of the cup and plate, but inside you are full of greed and indulgence. 6, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly are beautiful, but within are full of death. 7, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you build the tombs of prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpent, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, which is it's talking about the prophets and also the disciples, the apostles. Some will come, you will flog them in your synagogues and persecute them from town to town, Paul, so that you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. Stephen. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. See, your house is left to you, desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Tuesday gets intense. So 22 through 25 is all Tuesday. And it's all of these things when he's going through this. This is also when the disciples point out, look at the temple, look at these buildings. Oh my goodness, they're amazing. And he goes, well, I'll build it up in 3 days. He is not speaking of the actual temple. He is speaking of what is infinitely more important than the temple, which is God and Jesus. And so crucifixion, and he will build it back up in 10 days. So he tells just parable after parable after parable on Tuesday in these 3 chapters, just hammering in over and over again exactly what's about to happen, and yet almost no one knows this. So in 26 is when they start plotting to take Jesus, and they say, well, not during the feast, not during the Passover, because there will be an uproar among the people. So he is at Bethany at this point, and this is also when the woman comes and washes his feet with ointment, which is again enforcing that that he is about to die. So the disciples then prepare the Passover, and Judas is the one who is to betray him, and he says, whoever. He says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at my house, or at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus directed them, and they prepared the Passover. 26 verse 20. And when it was evening, he reclined at a table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, is it I, Lord? And he answered, He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had never been born. And Judas, who would betray him, answered, Is it I, Rabbi? And he said to him, You have said so. Now, I find it interesting. He says, The man who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. What you might not realize is, yes, this is in reference to Judas, but there's someone else who betrays Jesus in a different way during Thursday night / really early Friday morning, and that is Peter. Peter has also dipped his hand in the dish, because all of them would have. Peter also dipped his hand in the dish to get the bread. And so not only is Jesus saying, Judas will betray me, he is also indicating what Peter is going to do. And so there you go. And then also notice verse 30 in Matthew 26. And when they had sung a hymn, they went to the Mount of Olives. I love that. If there is no other reason why I urge and strongly urge everyone to sing in church and everyone to sing praises to God, not only is it commanded a lot in the Bible, like a lot, Jesus did it. If Jesus is fine with singing, we don't know if his voice was good, we don't know if he had perfect pitch, we don't know any of these things. But if Jesus is fine with singing, how can someone say, no, I don't want to? Because I rant about this frequently. I can't tell you how many times I have seen, and when I was in college, guys in our class, the girls would all mostly sing, but the guys wouldn't sing at church. We would go, why aren't you singing? Oh, my voice isn't that good. I prefer to just listen. And just silly excuses like that. And finally, at one point, I said, if Jesus was fine with singing, what makes you able to say no? And they said, what? And I said, well, if Jesus did it, why would you say no to it as if it's a sin? Did Jesus just sit and listen to his apostles and go, no, I just want to hear you guys sing. It's just good for you guys to sing. I don't really have that good of a voice. I just prefer to listen to other people. Nope, he sang. So what excuse do you have? You should be singing. So anyways, there's my little spurt on people should be singing. So anyways, they have Passover. Well, I'm skipping around a little. I'm sorry. I get excited about all of this and I skip around a bit. So Peter and John prepare the Passover. He washes the disciples' feet and tells them that is their example. They partake in the Lord's Supper. They sing a hymn and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And then we have the betrayal and the arrest. So, when they went to Gethsemane, he said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. Taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. When he said to them, My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Another translation of that is, Wait here and stay awake with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Which is the perfect example of how one is to pray in troubled times, like we're in right now. Is not something to say, oh, I feel like this is being super mean. Can you not? It's, I ask this be taken away, but as always, your will, not mine. And I know that good will come from this. So, just, so good. So then the disciples fall asleep. He comes back and he says, you couldn't stay awake and pray with me for 1 hour. And they say, oh, I'm sorry. And he says, okay, stay awake. Flesh is weak. Spirit is willing. Don't fall into temptation. And again, for the second time, he went and prayed and said, My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them, he went away and prayed for a third time. Saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said, Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise and let us be going, for my betrayer is at hand. When he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him great crowd with swords and clubs. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, The one that I kiss is the man, and seize him. So this was a common greeting where you'd kiss someone on the cheek. So basically, the person who I greet is the one to go get. And Jesus said to him, I skipped. And he came up to Jesus and said, Greetings, Rabbi. And he said, and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you came to do. Notice, Jesus still calls him friend because you are not to hate your enemies. You are to love your enemies. And so even in the moment when he's being portrayed by Judas, he is showing this example to his disciples and to others, for it's been written down. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. That would be Peter. And the name of the servant is actually recorded. Hold on. I think it's in Luke. Give me a second. The name of the servant is also recorded in the Bible, which I find fantastic because this just is so great. One of them struck the servant, cut off his right ear, no more of this, and he touched his ear and healed him. That is something interesting. Only Luke says that the ear is healed. Only Luke specifies that it's the right ear. Only Luke says that it is healed. And then after that, they take him to the temple. Is it John? Where is this? Sorry. I want to find this, and I'm confused that I can't find this. Hold on. Bear with me a moment. You can take a second and try to find it before I do. Malchus. His name's Malchus. It's in John 18. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that my Father has given me?" And so a band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. So there you go. There's that. Okay, sorry, back to Matthew. Sorry. I want to know these things. I knew it started with an M. I wanted to say it was Malchias, but that seemed wrong and I wanted to be sure before I spoke heresy. It's Malchus. Okay. So anyways, they take Jesus and also remember how I said earlier that the Jesus says the hand that dips in the cup will betray me. And it's everyone always says that's obviously Judas. It's also Peter. And on top of that, it's everyone else. And how do you know it's everyone else? Because in Matthew 26, verse 56, all the disciples left him and fled. And so every single one of them leaves him and abandons him. So, at that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out against us as a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Now, this was highly illegal. I should mention this. Everything that they do from this point in terms of capturing Jesus and his trial is completely illegal according to the Mosaic Law. All of it. Everything's illegal. First off, if you were going to take someone, you were not to do it in the middle of the night, sneaking it away. It had to be public so that it could be obvious to everyone there was no foul play involved and that it was legal. Because if you're taking someone in the night, you're ambushing them. That's not fair. And so, literally, they're breaking the law from the get-go. Also, they're bribing Judas, which is also against Mosaic law. So, at least 2 counts against the law at this point by the high priests who know the law. And that's just the worst. Okay, so then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered, and Peter was following at a distance. And they were seeking false testimony. The chief priests and the whole council, which is the Sanhedrin, were seeking false witness and false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. So this is, again, against Mosaic law. At some point, I'm going to have to write down every Mosaic law they break, because there's a lot. There's a lot. It was illegal to have a false witness. Completely illegal. It is also illegal to bear false testimony in Mosaic law and in American law. So they bring forward all of these false witnesses and ask them to testify against Jesus, and yet even with them trying to testify as false witnesses, they still can't find anything that is a high enough crime for Jesus to be put to death, which is just absolutely insane. So finally, two came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are Christ, the Son of God." Which is very funny, since Jesus is literally the living God. That he's saying, by you, basically, without acknowledging it's Jesus. He's saying, by your life, testify that you are God. And you just said, by God, testify you're God. I am, so don't know what to tell you on that. And Jesus said, "You have said so." Because you just said, by the living God. You have said so. Which is a fun amount of humor that's thrown in there, and I find that fantastic. Jesus says to him, "You have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy." Actually, no, he didn't. You literally said, "I adjure you by the living God." And he says, "Yep, that's me. You said it. I didn't say that, but you did." And then he says, "Oh, blasphemy," and accuses him, which is, oh my goodness. "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and says, "You were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean." And so he denies it 3 times. 3. And then he swore, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. So he is taken to Caiaphas. After this, he is then taken to Pilate. Now, after he's taken to Pilate is when Judas hangs himself. Judas hangs himself because he realizes his guilt. Only then. Partially because he didn't, I think, by some indications, and I'm not going to say this is a solid thing because someone might come forward and go, "That's heresy." By some indications, Judas didn't know they were going to try and kill him. He thought they were going to just, question him and put him on trial and stuff, but he didn't think he would die. And as soon as that becomes a reality, and it becomes that, verse 3 of chapter 27 of Matthew, "Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.' And they said to him, 'What is that to us? See to it yourself.' And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of money, said, 'It is not lawful to put them in the treasury, since it is now blood money.' So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore the field has been called the field of blood to this day." This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, "They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for a potter's field, as the Lord directed me." With that is, oh gosh, what, Jeremiah, that's Zechariah 11:13 is at least one of that reference. So then on Friday, his first trial is with Annas, which is to kill time until the Sanhedrin arrives, because everyone's asleep. This is the middle of the night / ridiculously early morning. So Annas was the father of Caiaphas, the high priest. So that was the trial that we partially witnessed. And then the second trial goes before the Sanhedrin, which is when they're finding they've actually find 2 people to say, "Oh, he said he would tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days." And that's when he goes before the Sanhedrin and is condemned. The third trial is at dawn. So there's 3 trials. The third one is at dawn, and that's when Peter is outside and denies Christ. 3 trials. Jesus is then taken to the Romans. Pilate. The 4th trial is before Pilate. And so they send him to Pilate. who is the governor. So it says he is the governor. The governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." When he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor, Pilate, was greatly amazed. So he goes before Pilate. Then there is we can release someone. Who should we release? Barabbas, a murderer, or Jesus, who said he could tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Why is this that big of a deal? And also has healed people. So he says, "Whom do you want me to release to you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they delivered them up. Mr. Harkin is very fond of saying that all sin, the root of all sin, and this is in the New Testament, comes from either envy or selfish ambition. So basically envy or pride, or envy or self-gain. So this is out of envy that this is happening. Judas, when he sinned, it was out of selfish ambition, wanting more money, basically. So greed. So it was out of envy they were doing. So while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him saying, "Have nothing to do with the righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Notice the strength of that language. And the governor said to them, Pilate, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Now remember, Jesus on Tuesday, when he was talking to the Pharisees, oh my goodness, this is like Matthew 23, verses 29 through 36 is when they're literally fulfilling this, where he says, "Woe to you! I will send you prophets, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the innocent blood of Abel to Zechariah. Truly, these things will come upon this generation." And he's talking about how they have murdered the prophets and how they said, "Oh, if we had been there, we wouldn't do that." And he says, "No, no, no, no. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you brood of vipers. You are bearing witness against you who murdered prophets." So he's fulfilling that a couple days later. Okay, so then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So having whipped him. There is a wonderful quote by C.S. Lewis that says that the testing point of every virtue is courage, basically. And he says that, the thing is, even Pilate was merciful until it became dangerous for him to be so. That's in Screwtape Letters. I can't remember which one, if the parents wanted to look it up. So even Pilate was merciful until it became dangerous. So you'll notice Pilate was not wanting to kill him until he realized, ooh, this could start a riot and I could maybe get fired and lose my job because the emperor might hear about this and go, "Why have you lost control of Jerusalem?" So I can either save this man or not lose my job. Yep, okay. I'm going to say that I'm not guilty of this by washing my hands, and yeah, just let me keep my job. Which is despicable. Okay. So after this, there's the fifth trial, which is before Herod, who asks for a miracle. So he's saying, "Oh, I can save you. Just do a miracle for me or something." And Jesus says, "No." And he goes, "Yeah, just, little miracle, something like that." Quiet, Jarvis. Okay, so then the sixth trial is before Pilate. This isn't really in Matthew. It's in the other ones, the trials back and forth between Pilate and Herod. And it actually says they became friends in that day because they had not liked each other before. Because basically both of them are going, "Oh, we need to save our jobs. So I'm going to send you to Herod because you're from Galilee. And Galilee's Herod's area, and Herod's in Jerusalem right now. So go talk to him." And then Herod goes, "I could lose my job. And you're not doing a miracle for me. Okay, well, this all took place in Jerusalem, which is technically Pilate's jurisdiction, so back to Pilate. So literally, they're doing a back and forth of, I don't want to lose my job, you deal with it. I don't want to lose my job, you deal with it. And so Pilate sells it, and then after that, they become friends because they essentially work together to not get fired or in trouble with the emperor. So after the trial with Pilate, Jesus is scourged, then mocked. Jesus carries the cross, and there are 7 sayings that happen from the cross, which I will leave you to find. So a couple things to be noticed about this, because Friday is when things get intense. So at the crucifixion, from 12 noon from 12 noon there's darkness, which is representative of the plagues in Egypt. And you might wonder, why is it the plagues in Egypt? I'm about to tell you. So there is darkness. Then the curtain is torn and there's an earthquake. And I'm not going to get emotional. I'm going to do my best to not do that. So from the 6th hour, there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, this man is calling on Elijah. And one of them took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and rocks split. And tombs also were opened, and many of the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And a centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, and they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. I'm sorry. This gets me every time, because despite what they did, and despite mocking him, and beating him, and whipping him, and crucifying him, it is one of the most wonderful things in the Bible that instantly Christ works for others. Because in verse 50 it says, he cried again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And the very next thing is that the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And if you don't know why that is such a big deal and why it gets me literally every time, I will tell you. Because the curtain was the separation. There was, with the temple, you know the layout, I won't draw it on the whiteboard. With the temple, there was the front curtain, which was Jewish men could not go past that curtain. That was only the priests. And then there was the curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place, where the mercy seat was. And the curtain rips, which means that it is not just for the high priest to be in the presence of God one time a year, or just for the priest to be in where the Lord's Supper happens, because the bread, it is for everyone. And so in his death immediately, even for those people who did this to him, the curtain is torn for them to be able to access God through him, despite what happened and what they did. Also, I should mention, with that, it's very interesting that I mentioned the plagues, yes. So with the plagues, Jesus is often described as the Paschal Lamb, or the Lamb of God. Now with Passover, you would kill a lamb that was a perfect, unblemished, spotless lamb, and you would spread the blood on the lintels of the doorway and on the doorposts, and, well, doorpost, lintel, and you would not break any bones. You wouldn't do that to it. Jesus, generally let me, scattered right now. When someone was on the cross, it was a suffocation method, essentially. If your arms are raised up like this, it's lifting your collarbones, and it starts to suffocate you. And because you had that little step out that you could put your feet up on, you could stay alive for a decent amount of time, actually, if you did that. So after people had been on a cross for too long, they would come by and they would break their legs so that they couldn't push themselves up anymore, and they would suffocate. With Jesus, because he is already dead, they don't break his bones, because you wouldn't break the bones of a Paschal lamb for Passover. You wouldn't do that. And instead, they stab his side with a spear, and he bleeds blood and water. So literally what's happening is the people are celebrating Passover, and actual Passover is happening with Christ, where there is darkness, like with the Egyptians, and the death of the firstborn, which is Jesus. And at the same time, he is the final Passover sacrifice for all people, which is just unbelievably cool. Okay, the other thing, he is taken to Golgotha, and Golgotha was outside of Jerusalem. He is being sent, much like the scapegoat, out of the camp, but he is also being the atonement offering that is killed for the people. So he is sent out of the camp and away, but also Golgotha was a hill, a rocky mountain/hill, which, if you remember from our lectures, mountains are closer to God. So in one way, this is heartbreaking. Well, in a lot of ways, it's heartbreaking, because he is sent away and murdered. In another way, it is the greatest portion of the Bible, because since this is close to God, it is in God's face saying, I have covered all people forever, because I have died for them. So it is obvious and clear and cannot be revoked. And that's wonderful. However, none of this would be good unless Christ is resurrected. And he is. So, Saturday, Pilate grants a guard and sets a seal on the tomb after Jesus is taken away and buried. Then on Sunday, Jesus rises from the dead before dawn, which, notice, he was being tried, convicted, and put on trial, whipped, all of that before dawn, which was illegal. And so when he rises from the dead, it is before dawn, because remember, the sun rises in the east. And that's fantastic. And there are 5 appearances that happen on Sunday. One is to Mary Magdalene. One is to the myrrh bearers, as they are called, which is the women who go to the tomb to put spices on his body. One is the road to Emmaus. And, 4 is to Simon Peter, and then 5 is to the disciples, but not to Thomas. And then later it is to Thomas. And there we go. And he finishes off Matthew with, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. One more thing that's more of a fun factoid than anything else. I'm sorry, this has gotten really long, but worth it to spend time on this. Thursday is often called Maundy Thursday, Maundy, Maundy Thursday. People go, why on earth is that? Well, it actually comes from the Latin mandatum, which means commandment, and that is when Jesus is commanding them in their final instructions before he goes on trial to be crucified, is on Thursday at the Lord's Supper. He gives them commands. So it's called Maundy Thursday because of that. So if you ever heard that term and didn't know why, that's why. Anyways, I will leave you with that. Apologies for getting emotional. It does it to me every year. And it's a good thing too. Because how miraculous and how wonderful and how amazing in every way. So, I hope you all have a good Holy Week, and maybe remember some of the stuff that's happening on each day. I'm recording this on Monday, so on Monday this would be when he was turning over the tables in the temple, and then immediately turning around and healing people in the same area. So, anyways, I leave you with that. I hope you have a wonderful week and a wonderful spring break.